Hi everyone, I hope you're having a great day. I am glad to be joined today by Ola Tunander, a leading Swedish IR scholar and emeritus professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, who has focused on maritime strategy since the 1980s. So a good 30 years of background looking at security policy and, of course, written many books on geopolitics, maritime strategy, focusing on Russia, especially in its relationship with the Scandinavian countries. And yeah, a key research focus, which I was very interested in, has been this um, yeah, focus on fake Russian submarines used in PsyOps by Sweden's allies, actually, within the Swedish waters during the Cold War, and yeah, again, what this had the intentions to do, which was to create fears about Moscow, end Sweden's neutrality, and pull the country towards NATO. Well, first, let me welcome you. It's great to see you again, Nola.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
I was hoping if you can perhaps provide some of the historical context, because again, the advantage you having 30 years of history behind this is you go all the way, of course, back to the Cold War. Well, what are this historical context of the nature of the US and UK having this psyops in Sweden during the Cold War era, that is?
Yeah, I mean, the one major aspect is, of course, the Swedish Social Democrats, who were not really American and not, they pushed for a neutral policy, and it was primarily the Prime Minister Olof Palme, who was Prime Minister 69 to 76, and then 82 to 86. So he was, and he was a major figure also on the international scene. So I think that they were not. I think Nixon once called him that Swedish asshole, and so in a more colorful way, I think they were not happy with the Swedish policy, and they had collaborated very closely with the part of the Swedish military establishment. Some people were very, 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 very close to the Americans, and this was and this made. I spoke with James Schlesinger, who was heading the CIA in during the Nixon administration. And I asked him about his view on the Sweden and so on, and he said, which Sweden? The political Sweden or the military Sweden? The military was planning for us to come as soon as possible. And of course, it was not all the military, but it was a certain group inside the Swedish, and they collaborated closely with the British and with the Americans. And when they were not happy with the Swedish policy, they could let some submarines turn up in Swedish archipelagos and make the Swedes hysterical. And what happened it started really from 81 and went on to 83, or also the whole 80s actually. But in 3 years, the Swedish public changed their views totally from, they 25, 30% believed that Soviet Union was a real threat or a kind of enemy to Sweden, and this changed in 3 years to 83%. So Sweden became a different country in 3 years, and that was primarily because of the submarine intrusions, and it started with it's in a way the real trouble started with a Soviet whiskey-class submarine entering Swedish fjord in 1981, October 1981, and that was a very strange thing, because the submarine went into a fjord where you couldn't dive. So if you go with the Whiskey-class submarines, as it was, or called Project 613, I think, in Russia, in Soviet Union, and they had to go on surface. And why, if you are doing espionage, why do you go with a submarine on surface? So it's a little bit strange. And then actually they found out that it had, it went up on an island, and they tried, and when the diver went down, they found that the submarine had tried to get high up on the island. So it was very strange, and it was even equally strange was that the American attachés were there already when it happened, outside the Swedish naval base of Karlskrona in South Sweden, and the chief of staff wasn't informed about that the attachés were going to come there, but he interrogated the crew, or some people in the crew. But he was ordered to interrogate the captain, the regular navigator, the political officer, and someone more. But he was not ordered to interrogate the real navigator, who was a commodore, a captain or a commodore. But he was the most senior officer on board, and he was not questioned. And he was the one who had navigated the submarine the last 2 days. So the whole thing was very strange. And when the chief of staff, he afterwards believed that this man, Avrukevich, had run the submarine into Swedish waters. It's a huge amount of evidence for that, actually, and that also the Swedes knew about it in beforehand, and the British, someone on the Swedish side, or a couple of people on the Swedish side at least, and the Americans. So this was this was treated as, by the media and the public, all, as if this was a intrusion for espionage and preparing for a military attack or something like that. But at the same time, the Americans actually operated submarines in Swedish waters that were not regular American submarines, but small Italian vessels. And the background for this is a deal between the Americans, the later chief of naval intelligence and deputy CIA, Bobby Inman, and the Swedish, someone in the Swedish defense ministry, probably the defense minister Sven Andersson, in 1965-67. And it was a deal between the Swedish chief of intelligence and the American chief of naval intelligence in 1965 to have Bobby Inman, who was a young assistant attaché at the time, and he was working 2 days a week from 65 to 67 at the Swedish Defense Ministry, and putting on his Swedish civilian clothes and so on, and then he was ordered to find out what did the Soviet submarines do in Swedish waters, and they had a deal to put up hydrophones in Swedish waters, which was extremely secret, and still is actually. And they put up these hydrophones, and they were not a cable. It was not a regular SUSE system, but it was hydrophones on Swedish territorial waters, and they were sending messages to patrol aircraft that pass over about with submarines passing by. And so they knew perfectly well where the Soviet submarines were. And but the problem was that this was not, or almost certainly not, known by the prime minister. And you couldn't have the cable to land as you have in Norway, for example. But so you had this, and these submarines had to be maintained. And then they had small submarines operating from merchant ships. So you had a US merchant ship going into Swedish waters, or going with oil or something like that to Helsinki, or to the north, to Luleå maybe, and so on. And then they dropped the small mini sub in Swedish territorial waters close to Karlskrona or close to Stockholm archipelago or something like that. And then this submarine maintained the hydrophones, and then was picked up on the way back by the merchant ships. So this is, if you have seen James Bond had one film that showed, that the submarine went into a merchant ship secretly and so on. And this was this was before James Bond had his film, so to speak. So it might have been some leaks about it. But they used Italian submarines because Italians had the best small mini subs. The Cosmos class, for example, was used, and they were, from the US point of view. I asked John Lehman, who was the Secretary of Navy in the 80s, and why they use Italian, and he said for plausible deniability. Because everyone knows how the Italians are, so you can never trust the Italians. So this is a kind of way of, the Americans do that all the time. They always have tried to use some others for plausible deniability when it is these kind of very, very secret operations. But that means that you had a system of very small submarines, 20 to 30 meters long, operating in Swedish waters from 1970 and in the 80s. And what the CIA director Casey could do was just to let this submarine turn up on the surface. And people became hysterical, because the Russians are coming. So this was it changed the public opinion totally. And, many people had seen submarines in Swedish archipelagos, or even inside naval bases and inside Stockholm Harbor. And it was also the British who did it, actually. It was an interview in 2000, which was a quite important interview, with the Caspar Weinberger, who was a defense secretary in 1980s during the Reagan administration. And he said, we operated regularly and frequently in Swedish waters. And that was necessary to strengthen to increase the readiness on the Swedish side. They knew about it. It was Navy to Navy consultations. The Swedes knew everything. He said, but that was only part of the truth, because it was only some people in the Navy who knew. But the prime minister and the foreign minister and so on did not know. So, yeah.
Well, so this is, so you mentioned before this, which Sweden, suggesting that it's split. Is this, would this be then public, which is very, more apprehensive about getting pulled into a military bloc, versus military leaders who, in the Swedish military, who are much more favorable of gravitating towards this. How would this split be defined?
I think you could say it's an elite split. So you had, if you look at, you had some people on the political level, the prime minister, the foreign minister, his state secretary, and so on. A group of people, let's say 10, if you say 10 people or something like that, that are closely linked to the prime minister and his foreign policy. And then you have a group of people on the military side, not least in the Navy, actually. Some admirals, and not necessarily the chief of defense, but probably. I mean, it's not clear, his position, really. But I mean, the later chief of defense certainly did not know about it. And so they were pretty upset. The chief of defense was in replacing Lennart Ljung, who was primarily in the 1980s. And from the late 80s, Bengt Gustafsson, who was the chief of defense, he knew nothing about it. And I visited his place I spoke with him the day after the TV program, where he also was interviewed. And he had said something like, this is illegal. If some people in the Navy had done this, this is illegal. And they would have to go to prison, This was, and while I was sitting there, the former chief of Navy, his chief of Navy, called him and says, could we talk and so on, and could I bring the chief of Navy that was I had before me and so on. So it was and they had to coordinate their language, because they had to lie, and they had to lie in a credible way. So this was so for example, there was after this interview with Caspar Weinberger, who said that we operated regularly in Swedish waters, and after an interview with the British Navy Minister Keith Speed, who said the same, then there was an official inquiry that the Prime Minister decided about, and it was Ambassador Rolf Ekéus who was heading this inquiry, and Ambassador Matthias Mossberg, who was the Secretary General, and I was a civilian expert from the beginning. And this inquiry, when Matthias Mossberg went to the naval base, the Muskö Naval Base Intelligence Archive, he found a document saying that some admirals have to coordinate their language because of what Caspar Weinberger has said. And so this document was about that they were going to coordinate their language and what they should say and so on. And then the military expert to the inquiry said, we have this document at the ministry, at the defense ministry, where our inquiry was located. So you don't have to take a copy of it. And Matthias Mossberg then did not take a copy, and he came back to the ministry, and there were no documents in the ministry. And then he went back to the intelligence archive, and they said, we haven't heard about this kind of document. We don't know what you're talking about, So this was a kind of what they were up to, It was the military expert in the inquiry was playing a dirty trick, So this is and the government did not know anything. I mean, the prime minister, the foreign minister, defense minister, and it was a I think it was a very dirty game, but extremely successful, because you could change the Swedish public opinion in 3 years, totally. And you had this. You had, on the one hand, you had this whiskey-class submarine, Soviet submarine, that had their one person at the submarine must have had some kind of deal with people on the western side. There was also a British document stating that the Swedes knew that this submarine was going to come.
This is why it's strange, because the title of one of your books is The Secret War Against Sweden, and we're outlining the PsyOps against Sweden for the purpose of shifting public opinion towards abandoning neutrality. But it's not as if it's a conspiracy. It's based on evidence, and yet it's not really spoken about. And there's very few people who, again, because one shouldn't speak about these matters, it's not really brought up, and it doesn't disrupt the narrative in any way. Instead, it's the reason why the desire to join the military alliance, it somehow is sold to the public as simply being a direct result of Russia being threatening. But it is interesting that alliance systems, well, one of the key reasons why the literature tends to be very critical of military alliances is because they become dependent on perpetual conflict. That is, they say if peace breaks out, then there's less need for the alliances and they begin to die out. And this is very problematic. Indeed, you saw this with NATO in the 90s. They came up with slogans, what was it? Expand or die. They had, out of area or out of business. So in other words, if there's no Soviet threat, we have to, either expand or begin sending NATO to, well, invade other countries otherwise, or peacekeeper, or whatever you want to call it, humanitarian interventions. Otherwise, there won't be a purpose for us anymore. We need to reinvent a purpose. Otherwise, the bloc disappears. And this is often the threat of these military alliances. They need they need conflicts, and as we often see, they end up existing for the purpose of dealing with the security concerns or security threats caused by their own existence. But there's Sweden, I guess, is a fascinating case study, but it's not the only one. If you look at the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, this was, to a large extent taking advantage of the French invasion, or even provoking it to the extent that you can have German unification. I know in 1956, when the the Soviets and the Japanese were discussing or putting together a peace agreement about the Southern Kuril Islands, so resolving territorial differences. This was met with great alarm in Washington, because if they would resolve their territorial disputes, they might actually reach a peace. And Japan was a key bridgehead for the Americans in East Asia. So again, the fear was that peace could break out. And
Yeah, no, I think it's very. I mean, first, I will mention shortly that these operations were not NATO operations. These were US and British operations. So, and I spoke sometime with the former Norwegian Chief of Defense, Vigleg Eide, who was also chairman of NATO Military Committee, and he argued that these operations were so secret in Swedish waters that you couldn't have it inside NATO. It couldn't be a NATO decision because they were too secret. So it was and I think also I have, actually many people who use the same words, that these were US and British, but of course the commander submarines, I think, for Eastern Atlantic, NATO commander was a British commander. He was also at the same time chief of also flag officer submarines in Britain, so who would be the one who briefed the his Swedish counterpart about these upcoming operations. So he knew it, but not as a NATO officer, but as a British officer. And one other example that I think is very clear is I had a friend who was the chief of intelligence in Norway in the late 80s and early 90s, was Alf Roar Berg. And he said that in 1988, autumn 88, they had a NATO intelligence steering committee, which was a top committee in NATO for intelligence operations, and who in practice, decided what kind of policy NATO should have. And at the meeting, the British and American representatives, so chief of DIA or director DIA and chief of British military intelligence, defense intelligence, they came and argued that the threat from Soviet Union is imminent. And that was, when the talks between Gorbachev and Reagan was going on, and it was actually Russia had started to disarm quite a lot, and there were no readiness at all. And but the most intelligence services in Europe did not know, because they had no knowledge about actually what happened inside the Soviet Union. But Norwegians knew. They knew everything what happens in the northwest of Soviet Union, and they said, this is a lie. This is not true. There is no readiness at all. There is no imminent threat. So and after some discussion, one after the other joined the Norwegian position and left the British-American position. But you could say one thing is that you have to be pretty strong to go against the British and Americans in this case. But also, it's clear that the British and Americans used NATO for their own purpose. So this was it's not the policy in NATO is to large extent run by the British and Americans. And when they have, but it's sometimes it's possible to stop, to veto it, so to speak. But you have to come up with something really strong to do it. So it says something about how NATO functions. Actually, it's if you were thinking in terms of politics, it's a front rather than a kind of central committee or something like that. So NATO is something that is used by primarily the British and Americans.
Yeah, so more of an instrument. But I was wondering why all this focus on Sweden. Again, I know that during the Cold War we had a belt of more or less neutral states going throughout Europe from the north to south. So you can put, Sweden, Finland, Austria, Switzerland. I guess Yugoslavia also fits in there as a bit of a buffer between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But what were, besides bringing them clearly into the NATO ledger? Why is Sweden so strategic for the Brits and Americans?
I think during the Cold War, the most important was that Sweden had a number of airfields, and Sweden was extremely well located for the US Air Force. So it was the scenario was is that when a war starts on the Central Front, the US aircraft in West Germany has to move somewhere. And they could move to Britain, which is rather far from Soviet Union, but they could also move to Sweden. And from Sweden, they could open up the air defense in the Baltic area. They could have an air cover over the center front. And Sweden was, in that sense, ideal. So, for example, while the US defense attaché in Norway was a naval officer, in Sweden it was an air officer. And because in the very first hours of a conflict, Sweden would receive US aircraft. That was the intention by the military Sweden, I put it that way, the people who were collaborating closely with the Americans. While, for example, the political Sweden with Olof Palme, most likely, and he didn't hand over this policy to his successor in 1976, and he most likely argued that this would mean that the Swedish air bases would be taken out by the Soviets in the very first day, and this was and the Soviets couldn't have done it at the time with conventional air bases, conventional bombs, because in that case they would have to bomb the Swedish bases continuously, actually, because you could repair airstrips and so on. So so they would very likely use nuclear weapons, and Olof Palme most likely understood that is not so good for Sweden. So he didn't accept this policy, but the military side pushed, or parts of the military pushed for it strongly, actually. So this is what Sweden was, and I think also you had to have, for Sweden to join West in NATO, or join the NATO forces in a war, they had to be attacked by the Soviets, and the Soviets knew that. So they would not attack Sweden in the early phase, because they would, in that case, they would have to use huge amount of airplanes and so on for the Swedish front. So of course they were not interested in attacking Sweden, and so what you did was to prepare the Swedes with these submarines, because what they claimed then was that the Soviets would come with special forces, with Spetsnaz and so on submarines, and land the special forces in Sweden, and then they would take out the Swedish leadership, and then after that or military leadership and so on, and then they would be able to attack Sweden. But to attack over the sea is not so easy. It's if you know this ships coming, the Swedes would have taken them out. Wouldn't have been so difficult, actually. So the whole thing was very, very fishy, and the submarines were also not just a PsyOp for peacetime to change the mentality, but also PsyOp for preparation for a wartime operation, to be able to, you would have this submarine turning up, and you would have, which would very likely have been British, actually, because the British were training with using special forces in Sweden and Norway to collaborate with the stay-behinds. So they would land they had the Oberon class and Purpose class submarines for landing special forces in Sweden. I had a talk once with a British submarine captain who said I was just a taxi driver. I mean, he went along the Swedish coast, he went along the Norwegian coast also to land special forces. But he was just a taxi driver for the special forces. So he didn't know what they were doing. He knew nothing. I mean, it was run by the special forces, and they connected with the Swedish stay-behinds, and the Swedish stay-behinds were preparing for taking out the Soviet headquarters and whatever, in the Soviet forces entering Stockholm archipelago, first entering Stockholm, and then it was actually an exercise, the 28th of February, 1986, for the stay-behinds coming in, and for some special forces coming in to take out carrier of information. And this was a stay-behind exercise in the evening when Olof Palme was shot, and this was they actually prepared for taking out people who knew too much and should not fall in the hands of the Soviets. So take out Swedish people also. And this was the purpose of the exercise. And of course it was because of these submarine intrusions. There were British and American submarines, and they were let out. They got orders. The local officer got orders with ceasefires, and they were forced by the superiors to let the submarines out, and of course when it was British submarines and British submarines, then of course they were not thinking in these terms. They were thinking that it was Olof Palme who collaborated with the Soviets, and that he was a traitor. And it started what was called the naval officers' revolt against the prime minister, and where they discussed also to take him out. So you had this kind of the PsyOps, the psychological operations, had several dimensions in a way. It was a peacetime general dimension to change the view of the Swedish population. It was also a PSYOP that changed the view among the naval officers at a lower level that wanted to take out the prime minister, and it was a PSYOP preparing for what to do in the very, very first days of a war. So it was extremely successful, I would say, but it was but not for the people who wanted to have a kind of buffer zone between East and West, and kind of that thought that I mean, from a international law point of view, deterrence is not legal actually, because deterrence is threat, and threat towards the other side is not legal. But the Americans wanted to have Air Force deployments and missile deployments close to Soviet Union, so that they would have a credible deterrence, as they said. But the Soviets would perceive it very differently.
But if you forward to present time, now when Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago, we saw both Finland and Sweden rushing very quickly to abandon their neutrality and join NATO. I found this process to be very interesting because it all happened so fast because the public opinion had never been in favor of joining NATO. And in, of course, this shock that followed, it seemed to have been rushed very quickly. And when I saw people arguing for it, it was often people like General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg who was pointing out that, well, Putin wanted less NATO, now he has more. But it's not a great security strategy to try to rub your adversary's face into, an expanding military bloc. He never really went into the details exactly how this would elevate our security, if you consider that security derives from a balance between deterrence and reassurance. So again, especially Finland, given that they were the largest, they're their largest front line now, but they were a great success story for neutrality. No more conflicts since the war, the Second World War, and now suddenly this is heralded as a great achievement. Same with Sweden. 200 years of neutrality thrown away, very quickly without a referendum, and suddenly, this was a great achievement and a great advancement of security. How, from I guess, Swedish national, how would you explain this process of how Sweden was, I guess, rushed into this?
Yeah.
Because
No,
it
I
builds on
think
the
you
submarine
had
stories, obviously.
you had this, you could say that Sweden has historically a very anti-Russian tendency. I mean, you had the Swedish wars with the Russians in the 18th century, 19th century, and I was with a American military historian trip to St. Petersburg and 92 with an American colleague, and there it was also 4 Swedes from the military guy and one general also, and you could see how enthusiastic they were to look at the old Swedish territories. This was so you had the inside in Sweden, and on the military side, not least, you have a kind of very strong antipathy against the Russians. And very different from Norway, if you look at the Norwegian history. I mean, of course, you have strong criticism today against the Russians, but you don't have the historical tradition about that. And in Finland, you have very divided. You have the civil war in 1918 between the pro-Soviet and the Reds and the Whites, and this has also have an imprint on Finnish mentality. And when this change happened in Russia with Ukraine, then the traditional neutral people were pushed on the defensive, while the people who wanted to have they were really aggressive towards the Russians were winning. And I mean, of course, it was totally stupid. This kind of, I mean, this basis that they now have the acceptance of US bases in Finland, Sweden, and Norway, the recent 2 years, is that they will just be targets for Russian attacks if there will be a big war. And it's the planning, the Russian planning, or the Soviet planning, I should say, in the 1970s, 80s, was they had the Leningrad military district that was supposed to take Finland because they didn't trust the Finns. And they had continued in Murmansk, these forces were going to take Finnmark. But they did not believe that they could go further, really. To take territory is very difficult, as you could see now in Ukraine, for example. And so it was not what they would do was to take out all the US air bases, and what the Soviets would perceive as a threat. And the same is probably true today. So what happened when Finland announced that they were joining NATO? After half a year, President Putin said that we will recreate the Leningrad military district. I mean, just to tell the Finns that we are going to start to create a military district that has the major purpose to take Finland. And that was and that would not be that this military district did not exist before. I mean, after the Cold War, it was closed down.
But this is the security competition. If you're able to get Finland into NATO, then the Russians will have to respond. And now we can say, oh, now look, the Russians are aggressive. Now, a good thing we have NATO. But this is what I mean. It creates a demand for its own existence by.
Well,
But I wanted to ask though about but as you focus on maritime strategy, because the Scandinavian countries, I mean, not just bringing in Sweden and Finland, but also military bases, Finland, Sweden, and Norway. This is quite a dramatic shift. And as you mentioned, Sweden historically was a key rival of Russia. Indeed, Sweden was considered to be the leading power in the Baltic Sea until the Great Northern War, when it was defeated by the Russians in 1721. But for the Russians, a key part of their history has always been this lack of access, or at least reliable access to waterways. And on the western borders, they always have the Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and Arctic. Now, the Black Sea obviously has had a key role in has been a key reason also behind the Ukraine war, that the Russians were being seen to be squeezed out there, with ideally, of course, the United States wanted Crimea and pushing the Russians out. But Scandinavia, you put a lot of pressure both on the Baltic Sea as well as the Arctic, if you want to intercept submarines, if you want to put any possible, I guess, maritime containment, because I know the former, he's the Danish Prime Minister, but former NATO Secretary General Fogh Rasmussen, he was making this argument that, if we have conflict with the Russians now, with the Swedes and Finns in NATO, we can put a blockade on St. Petersburg. And you hear more and more talk about the Baltic Sea becoming a NATO lake should the Danes begin to intercept and block Russian ships, like trading ships. We're seeing more in America, there's talking more about now confronting the Russians in the Arctic. And of course, a lot of the Scandinavians have made themselves into a front line. They don't talk much about it in Norway. They're not even allowed to refer to it as American bases. They have a separate name for it. I forgot what it's in English, but it's because they're not supposed to have foreign bases on the soil, so they just call it something else. It's a very very George Orwell. How do you see this? Is this a return of history? Because but it's not just the seaways, but also now, if you would get the Arctic in, you can also challenge the Russians' northern fleet up in Murmansk. And already now people are talking, well, the Russians might in the future try to invade Lapland, which is the northern regions of Finland. So we have to have military bases there too. And now suddenly you're in very close proximity of Russia's northern fleet. So how do you see, where is this all going? Because again, Scandinavia was a region of peace. It looks like we are being prepared now to become really a real front line.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, you could, from a Scandinavian point of view, you could say that it's the weapons technology has changed the situation a bit. So, for example, this Oreshnik missile that the Russians shot to Dnieper in Ukraine, but it's very destructive, as I understand, and in a sense comparable to a very small nuclear weapon. And that means that the Russian can take out all these bases in one night, or if they want, in Scandinavian countries, but without nuclear weapons. And that is the positive side of it, because they don't need to use nuclear weapons for taking out these bases. So I think it's a kind of yeah. I mean, of course, it's stupid to have this kind of military bases, and the consequences, I think, in general, has been that it has been, too much of a preparation for, put in US aircrafts in different bases in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, and so on, that also made the Russians change their nuclear doctrine. So they now accept using nuclear weapons. If it's a major strike on Russia, they will respond with major conventional strike on Russia. They might respond by use of nuclear weapons. So this is a major shift. But you could say why the Swedes and the Finns accepted it. It was not. I know, some people, the senior diplomats, most senior diplomats, writing in Sweden against this agreement, and they could not publish their articles. So, if you have diplomats who have been ambassador to United States and or to Washington and so on, and couldn't publish, and had for the top diplomats on what had been on the social democratic side and so on, that couldn't publish, and then you wonder how this is organized, and it's not really. I think that we have to stop these voices or something like that. It's more that their arguments are so strange for these editors that they don't understand really. They couldn't imagine. So it is a if you want, a narrative that has been totally so watertight, so you couldn't even penetrate it. It doesn't matter now what kind of position you have had on the diplomatic side or the military side or so on. It is rather the small group of people hanging around in the bar on the Friday night, talking with each other and reading the New York Times and so on. And
Yeah. No, there's well, it's a strange clampdown on. There's no acceptance for dissent anymore, I notice. And again, it's kind of strange from Scandinavia, given that how much focus was given to the value of neutrality. That is, to if you do not provoke your adversaries, then you'll have peace. And as the Swedes, as the Finns are recognized, this would. They wouldn't have any problems with the Russians unless they began to host foreign troops on their soil and join military alliances, and that proved to be correct. And in Norway, which joined NATO, it was nonetheless NATO light. They didn't want any foreign troops on the soil because they thought, yes, we'll have the deterrent by NATO, but not provoke it with bases. But if again, what was common sense a few years ago, if this is put forward now to the media, it's seen as being somehow a pro-Russian argument that no, well, if you take into consideration Russian security concerns, that's a pro-Russian position. And, no one asked, the point of departure should be how do we enhance our own security? And then you do have to take into account the adversary's security, unless you believe that everything they do happens in a vacuum. I just had my final question was on given that you look at the maritime strategy, this is your 30-year career. How do you read the situation with Nord Stream? Because this is obviously, well, it's also key to the Baltic Sea. There's a destruction of this pipeline in 2022. You mentioned before the Americans, they like to have plausible deniability. There's not much plausible deniability left. I guess, the Americans say it was the Ukrainians. Our media will repeat it or just pretend as if Nord Stream never happened. But how do you see the situation now that 3 years has passed? Well, not 3 years, but at least over two, reaching 2 years and 2.5 years.
Yeah. No, it's maybe it's possible that something would come up during the Trump administration. I mean, it's they have a lot of reason to reveal things, but I don't know what will happen when it comes to Nord Stream, but it's for very clear that it was a huge American presence just a few months before the Nord Stream were taking out during the exercise in the exactly same area with the naval forces and air forces, and the days before when they took out the Nord Stream, there was also a huge American naval presence over the position of the explosions, you had a maritime patrol aircraft, Poseidon, that went 2 hours. No, 2 hours before the first explosion, went from Keflavik down to Bornholm, where the explosion took place. And the explosion took place 1 hour before it arrived, and when it passed off Norway, and then it was patrolling the area for 5 hours over the area of explosion after the explosion, and actually it was refueled over Poland, and the tanker aircraft that did refuel this Poseidon aircraft, it went up from the American base is in Western Germany at the very minute that the explosion took place, and started with the tanking, with the refueling of the Poseidon aircraft, and then the Poseidon aircraft could patrol over the area of the explosion for 5 hours. And this was pre-planned. You had a tanker aircraft going up at the minute when it happens, and the aircraft leaves 2 hours before it happens, and so there is no doubt that they knew about it, and they didn't tell the Russians or the Germans or the company in beforehand. So you could say it's very much very much evidence pointing to a U.S. operation and a major U.S. operation, but these Ukrainian sailing boat sailing with a Ukrainian flag and going to every harbor in the vicinity might have had a certain role, but it was just, as you said, for plausible deniability.
Yeah, well, it's not just they didn't say anything. What was suggested for months, if not the first year after the destruction of Nord Stream, was that the Russians were behind it. this was indeed used as a reason why we had to escalate the war in Ukraine, why NATO had to further militarize the Baltic Sea, because we still talk about the need now for NATO to defend the seabed in the Baltic Sea, but no, without that. But the whole thing was premised on the idea that the Russians were behind this. They blew up their own pipeline, which is apparently part of a very mysterious Russian playbook, which I
Yeah.
haven't received a copy of yet. But it's very no, it's quite fascinating, and yeah, even now afterwards that the Americans are recognizing, okay, it was the Russians. No one really goes back and address, well, if they knew that it wasn't the Russians before it happened, and they knew in advance it would happen, why are no one talking? How could they have tried to blame the Russians for it? This is just again the narratives don't work anymore. But
But I
everyone
think
seems very fearful of addressing the flaw in the narrative, because then they can be seen as, taking the side of the Russians, which is a very big no-no. So
you,
what can you do?
you had some submarine in or believed submarine intrusions in 2014 in outside Stockholm in the archipelago, and it was a lot of talks about it. And after the Caspar Weinberger interview in 2000, it was I think it was around 60% or something like that that said that it probably was Western submarines also, or so on. But in 2014, 14 years later, it was all forgotten. So now it was obviously Russian submarines entering Swedish waters and deep into Swedish waters. And the problem was that the Russian just had 1 kilo class submarines at the time, and it was not credible at all. But it shows how they interviewed some particular Swedish military officers and some so-called researchers, saying that must have been Russian submarines. And so it's the same. The first thing, and you had after this Nord Stream explosions, you had a TV program in all the Nordic countries that, in quotation mark, revealed that it was Russian that had taken out the Nord Stream pipeline. And you had an interview with a British intelligence or former intelligence officer who said, yes, what you should do is to look who has interested in it. And it's obvious that Russians are the only ones who have interest. And then you said, what is this? Because
It's amazing, after all these American leaders spent all this time warning that the Nord Stream was bad, we have to stop it, we're threatening to stop it, then it's blown up. Well, certainly the Americans wouldn't have any motivations. Even this we couldn't accept. It's it's very strange. But it was also the narrative that all traces are leading to Russia. Like, what traces? They never substantiate this claim. There was no evidence. There was no traces. There was, you know, just assumption that they want to send a signal. So we're going to blow up our $1 billion investment to send a signal. It's just nothing. Nothing really makes sense unless you
it,
think in the cliches of the stereotypes. So.
it was an interview with Condoleezza Rice on German TV 2014, where he said very clearly to the German public that you have to change your energy dependency. You had to go for American energy and take out your Russian energy. And so this was almost an order from, and of course, the decision to take out the pipeline was probably taken, or if not before 2014, so at least at 2014. So it is, and they did try in 1982 to destroy the pipeline, Russian pipeline to West Germany. So it was a And this was according to the Deputy National Security Advisor, Tom Reed, and according to to Dick Allen, who was National Security Advisor, they did it. I mean, the pipeline exploded, but the problem was that the Germans and the Russians continued to work on the pipeline, and this was probably what gave the kind of trust on the Russian side and on the West German side for the ending of the Cold War. So so this is pretty important, actually.
Well, now the pipeline is gone. The cheap gas is going to China and Asia. Europe is deindustrializing, and America's worried that Russia is growing ever closer to China. So it was probably not, yeah, no, not a great strategy to begin with. Anyways, Ola Tunander, thank you so much for your time. It's always great to speak with you.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.